They called Brenda Anderson reckless, dangerous, unfit to fly commercial aircraft. Her unconventional maneuvers and split-second decisions had cost her everything. Her captain's stripes, her reputation, her future. But on a clear Tuesday morning over the Swiss Alps, when EuroWings Flight 847 lost both engines with 89 souls aboard, those same reckless instincts would be the only thing standing between life and catastrophe. This is the story of how the pilot they grounded became the hero they never saw coming. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The morning briefing at Munich International Airport began at 6:15 a.m. sharp, but Brenda Anderson had been awake since 3:30 a.m. She sat in the back corner of the pilot's lounge, nursing her third cup of coffee and reviewing weather reports that she'd already memorized twice. Her uniform bore the single stripes of a first officer, a humiliating demotion from the 4 stripes she'd worn just 6 months earlier. At 28, Brenda possessed an intuitive understanding of aircraft that her instructors had called supernatural. She could feel turbulence patterns before instruments detected them, sense engine irregularities through subtle vibrations, and execute emergency procedures with a precision that bordered on artistry. Her flight log showed 0 incidents, 0 passenger injuries, and a safety record that should have made her untouchable. Instead, she was untouchable for all the wrong reasons. The other pilots filed into the briefing room with their usual morning banter, but conversations died when they noticed Brenda. She'd grown accustomed to the whispers, the sideways glances, the way senior captains suddenly found urgent paperwork when she approached. Captain Klaus Weber, the chief pilot, avoided her gaze entirely as he began the daily operations briefing. Today's weather shows clear skies across most European routes, Weber announced, his weathered face stern as granite. Visibility excellent, winds favorable, standard operations across the board. His eyes briefly met Brenda's before quickly moving away. Anderson, you're assigned to cargo inspection duty. Terminal C, Base 7. Cargo inspection. Again. For the past 6 months, Brenda had been relegated to ground duties, checking freight manifests, inspecting cargo holds, updating maintenance logs, tasks that kept her away from cockpits and passengers, away from the sky where she belonged. The assignment was clear. EuroAir wanted her visible enough to avoid wrongful termination lawsuits, but invisible enough to forget she existed. Weber, she called out as the briefing dispersed, I'd like to request consideration for the Frankfurt route. My certifications are current, my medical is valid, and Anderson. Weber's voice cut through her words like ice. Your current assignment is cargo inspection. I suggest you focus on performing those duties satisfactorily before requesting additional responsibilities. The words stung because they carried the weight of institutional judgment. 6 months ago, Brenda had been EuroAir's rising star, the youngest pilot ever promoted to captain at the airline. Her unconventional flying techniques had saved 3 flights from potential disasters: a microburst in Rome, hydraulic failure over Amsterdam, and a bird strike approach into Prague. Each time, her split-second decisions and aggressive maneuvering had prevented catastrophe. But unconventional had become synonymous with reckless in the minds of airline management. Her techniques, while successful, deviated from standard operating procedures. They made executives nervous, insurance companies uncomfortable, and regulatory officials suspicious. When Captain Harrison filed his complaint about her dangerous and unpredictable flying methods, it provided the perfect excuse to ground her. As Brenda walked toward Terminal C, she passed the departure boards showing dozens of flights preparing for takeoff. Each destination represented hundreds of passengers trusting their lives to pilots who followed procedures, who colored within the lines, who never risked their careers for unconventional solutions. She wondered how many of those flights would encounter situations where following the book simply wasn't enough. The cargo bay felt like a prison. Surrounded by freight containers and mechanical equipment, Brenda methodically checked manifest numbers against shipping documents. Her mind wandered to the Airbus A340 she'd watched taxi past the terminal windows. the same aircraft type she'd mastered, the same controls she could operate in her sleep. Instead, she was counting boxes and verifying weights, using skills that any logistics clerk could perform. Her radio crackled with air traffic control communications from the active runways. She listened to the familiar cadence of takeoff clearances, altitude assignments, and routing instructions. Each transmission was a reminder of the career that had been taken from her, the sky that now seemed impossibly distant. But Brenda continued her cargo inspections with meticulous attention to detail, knowing that any mistake would provide ammunition for those who wanted her gone permanently. What none of them knew was that Brenda spent her off-duty hours in flight simulators, paying for sessions with her own money to maintain skills that EuroWings no longer wanted her to use. She studied every incident report, every emergency procedure, every scenario that could challenge a pilot's abilities. Her apartment was filled with aviation manuals, weather pattern analysis, and technical journals that most pilots never bothered to read. They'd grounded her body, but they couldn't ground her mind. And deep in her heart, Brenda knew that someday someone would need a pilot who understood that sometimes saving lives required breaking rules. The incident that destroyed Brenda's career had occurred on a routine flight from Barcelona to Munich 6 months earlier. EuroWings Flight 293 had encountered unexpected severe turbulence over the Pyrenees, the kind that sent passengers and crew slamming into cabin ceilings and triggered every emergency protocol in the manual. The official report stated that Captain Anderson had executed unnecessarily aggressive evasive maneuvers that exceeded safety parameters and violated standard operating procedures. What the report didn't mention was that Brenda's aggressive maneuvers had prevented the aircraft from encountering a downdraft that would have sent them plummeting 3,000 feet in less than 30 seconds. Her rapid altitude changes and unconventional banking angles had navigated them through an atmospheric phenomenon that meteorologists later classified as a once-in-a-decade event. All 157 passengers had landed safely without a single serious injury. But safety wasn't the issue. Compliance was. Anderson flew that aircraft like she was auditioning for an aerobatics team. Captain Harrison had testified during the disciplinary hearing. She pulled G-forces that exceeded passenger comfort limits, executed turns that weren't in any manual, and made decisions without consulting standard procedures. That's not piloting, that's showboating. The hearing room had been filled with executives who'd never experienced turbulence from a cockpit. Bureaucrats who measured success in insurance premiums rather than lives saved. They saw Brenda's unconventional techniques as liability risks, her intuitive flying as dangerous unpredictability. The fact that she'd saved a plane full of people was less important than the fact that she'd done it wrong. Miss Anderson, the disciplinary board chairman had said, his tone carrying the weight of institutional authority, your technical skills are not in question. However, commercial aviation requires adherence to established procedures. Our passengers trust us to operate safely and predictably. Your methods, while perhaps effective in this instance, create uncertainty and risk. Brenda had tried to explain that atmospheric conditions sometimes required responses that weren't covered in any manual, that split-second decisions often meant the difference between catastrophe and safety. She'd presented weather data, analyzed wind patterns, and demonstrated how her maneuvers had been precisely calculated to avoid disaster. Regulations exist for a reason, the chairman had replied. If every pilot decided for themselves which procedures to follow, we'd have chaos in the skies. Your demotion to first officer is effective immediately. You'll undergo remedial training on standard operating procedures before being considered for flight duties. The remedial training had been humiliating. Brenda sat in classrooms with rookie pilots, reviewing basic procedures she'd mastered years earlier. Instructors who'd never faced real emergencies lectured her on the importance of following protocols. She was required to demonstrate standard responses to simulated emergencies, forced to ignore her instincts in favor of textbook solutions. Miss Anderson, her instructor had said after she'd successfully completed a simulated engine failure, your technique is too creative. In this scenario, you should maintain standard glide speeds and follow checklist procedures exactly as written. Innovation is not required. Innovation is not required. The words had haunted Brenda throughout her demotion. EuroAir wanted pilots who were sophisticated autopilots, humans who followed programming without deviation or creativity. They'd created a system where thinking outside the box was grounds for punishment, where saving lives unconventionally was worse than losing them conventionally. Her colleagues' reactions had been mixed. Some expressed private support, acknowledging that her flying had prevented disasters, but public support was career suicide in an industry that valued conformity above all else. Most simply avoided her, unwilling to associate with someone who'd been branded as dangerous. "It's not personal, Brenda," her former co-pilot Sarah had explained over coffee, "but you have to understand how this looks. Management sees you as unpredictable, and unpredictable pilots make everyone nervous. Maybe if you just tone down your flying style." Tone down her flying style. Brenda realized that her greatest strength, her ability to read aircraft and weather conditions intuitively, to respond instantly to developing situations, had become her greatest weakness in an industry that prized predictability over performance. The worst part was watching other pilots struggle with situations she could have handled easily. She'd monitored radio traffic during several incidents where aircraft encountered problems that her experience could have resolved quickly. Instead, she watched from the ground as crews followed standard procedures that prolonged emergencies and increased risks. Now, 6 months later, she remained grounded, while less experienced pilots flew routes she knew intimately. Her expertise was considered dangerous, her instincts deemed untrustworthy, her record of success overshadowed by complaints about her methods. As she completed another cargo inspection in Terminal C, Brenda wondered if she'd ever be allowed to prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing a pilot could do was play it safe. The pattern of exclusion had become so routine that Brenda could predict it with mathematical precision. Every morning briefing followed the same script. Experienced captains received premium routes to London, Paris, and Rome, while she was assigned to cargo duties, equipment inspections, or at best, simulator maintenance. When emergency situations arose requiring additional crew, her name was consistently overlooked in favor of pilots with less experience but cleaner disciplinary records. The most painful instance had occurred 3 weeks earlier when Captain Mueller called in sick for the Frankfurt to Vienna route. Brenda had been in the operations center updating flight manifests when the call came through. She knew the route intimately, had flown it 47 times as captain before her demotion, and her replacement certification was current. For a brief moment, hope flickered in her chest. "We need a substitute captain for Flight 412, Weber announced to the room. His eyes swept across the available pilots, passing over Brenda as if she were invisible. "Hartman, you're qualified for the A320. Take the Frankfurt route." Captain Hartman, barely 6 months out of training, looked surprised by the assignment. "Sir, I'm not familiar with the Vienna approach procedures. The weather forecast shows possible wind shear conditions, and I haven't flown that route in challenging weather." "Anderson knows that route better than anyone," First Officer Chen whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. "She could fly it blindfolded." Weber's jaw tightened. "Hartman will manage perfectly well. Anderson, continue with your cargo inspections." The dismissal was absolute, final, crushing. Brenda watched from the terminal windows as Hartman's flight departed 2 hours late, delayed by his unfamiliarity with the route's unique approach patterns. She monitored air traffic control frequencies and heard him request vectors 3 times during the descent into Vienna, struggling with the crosswind approach that she could have executed effortlessly. The flight landed safely, but passengers had endured unnecessary turbulence and delayed connections. The exclusion extended beyond flight assignments. When EuroAir scheduled emergency procedure training sessions, Brenda's name was mysteriously absent from the roster. Advanced weather pattern seminars, new equipment certifications, safety committee meetings, all opportunities that could have enhanced her value to the airline were denied through bureaucratic oversight that felt increasingly deliberate. "Sorry, Anderson," the training coordinator had explained when she inquired about a mountain weather workshop. "The session is limited to active flight crew only, perhaps next quarter." Next quarter never came. The workshops continued without her, filled with pilots who would benefit from her experience but couldn't access her knowledge. Even social interactions became strained. The pilot's lounge, once a place where she had shared technical insights and flight stories, now felt like hostile territory. Conversations stopped when she entered, resumed in whispers when she passed. Former colleagues who had sought her advice now avoided her gaze, afraid that association with the reckless pilot might damage their own careers. During the monthly safety meeting, Chief Pilot Weber presented statistics showing EuroAir's improved compliance ratings. Our standardized approach to flight operations has resulted in 0 regulatory violations this quarter, he announced proudly. Consistency and adherence to procedures remain our top priorities. Brenda raised her hand. Sir, what about the incident last week where Flight 238 encountered unexpected microburst conditions over Milan? The crew followed standard procedures, but passenger reports indicated significant turbulence that could have been avoided with Anderson. Weber interrupted, his voice sharp with irritation. Flight 238 was handled appropriately according to established protocols. The crew's response was textbook perfect. Perhaps you should focus on understanding why following procedures is more important than improvising solutions. The room fell silent. Every pilot present understood the subtext. Brenda's insights weren't welcome, her expertise was considered dangerous, and her presence was tolerated rather than valued. She had become a cautionary tale, living proof of what happened to pilots who thought they knew better than the system. The psychological toll was devastating. Brenda found herself questioning instincts that had never failed her, second-guessing reactions that had saved lives. She began experiencing anxiety in situations that had never bothered her before, wondering if her confidence had been misplaced, if her unconventional methods really were as dangerous as everyone claimed. Her apartment became a shrine to aviation excellence she was no longer allowed to pursue. Flight manuals lined her bookshelves, weather analysis software ran constantly on her computer, and her walls were covered with aeronautical charts for routes she might never fly again. She studied obsessively, maintaining skills that EuroAir insisted were unnecessary, preparing for opportunities that seemed increasingly impossible. The most crushing realization came during a conversation with her father, a retired Lufthansa captain who had taught her to fly. Maybe it's time to consider other airlines, or perhaps a different career path entirely. Aviation has changed, Brenda. They want predictable pilots now, not gifted ones. Predictable pilots. The phrase haunted her as she completed another day of cargo inspections. EuroAir had succeeded in transforming one of their most capable pilots into an expensive inventory clerk, wasting expertise that could have made their operations safer and more efficient. But institutional momentum was stronger than individual talent, and the airline seemed determined to prove that conformity mattered more than competence. As she locked the cargo bay that evening, Brenda wondered if she'd ever escape the pattern of exclusion that had defined her life for 6 months. What she couldn't know was that tomorrow would bring a crisis where predictable pilots weren't enough, where following procedures would lead to catastrophe, and where the airline would desperately need someone reckless enough to save lives. While EuroAir relegated Brenda to ground duties, she embarked on a secret campaign of preparation that would have impressed military strategists. Her modest Munich apartment transformed into an unofficial flight training center, equipped with technology and resources that most commercial pilots never bothered to acquire. She understood that expertise required constant cultivation, regardless of whether anyone valued it. Every evening after her cargo inspection duties, Brenda drove to Flight Sim Munich, a private facility that offered high-fidelity aircraft simulators to freelance pilots. Using her savings, she purchased unlimited access to their Airbus A340 simulator, the same aircraft type that EuroAir flew on long-haul routes, but no longer trusted her to pilot. The simulator sessions cost more than her monthly rent, but she considered them essential investments in skills that might someday prove crucial. "You're here again?" asked Marcus, the facility owner, as Brenda arrived for her 4th session that week. Most pilots use these simulators to maintain minimum certification requirements, You're training like you're preparing for war." "I'm preparing for whatever comes next," Brenda replied, settling into the captain's seat that felt more like home than her actual residence. Emergencies don't schedule appointments. Her simulator sessions weren't random practice flights. Brenda had researched every major aviation incident from the past decade, analyzing scenarios where conventional responses had failed and unconventional solutions had succeeded. She programmed the simulator to replicate extreme weather conditions, multiple system failures, and crisis situations that standard training never addressed. During one session, she simulated the exact scenario that had destroyed Captain Sully Sullenberger's career: dual engine failure at low altitude with no suitable airports available. While most pilots practiced water landings as theoretical exercises, Brenda refined techniques for identifying alternative landing sites, calculating glide ratios under extreme stress, and managing passenger panic during unconventional approaches. "The key is maintaining aircraft energy while maximizing options," she explained to herself, narrating her decision-making process for later review. Standard procedures assume optimal conditions. Real emergencies require adaptive thinking. Her apartment study resembled a meteorologist's laboratory. Brenda had invested in professional weather analysis software that provided detailed atmospheric data for European air routes. She studied wind patterns, pressure systems, and turbulence forecasts with obsessive precision, developing an intuitive understanding of weather behavior that exceeded most airline meteorologists' knowledge. The software revealed patterns that standard weather briefings missed: microscale wind shear conditions that formed over specific mountain ranges, temperature inversions that created invisible turbulence pockets, and storm system interactions that could trap aircraft in dangerous conditions. Brenda memorized these patterns for every major route in EuroAir's network, building a mental database of atmospheric hazards that could threaten flights. She also subscribed to international pilot forums, where aviators shared experiences from challenging flights. These communities, operating outside official channels, provided insights that airline training programs never covered. Pilots discussed unconventional techniques that had saved lives, creative solutions to equipment failures, and decision-making processes during emergencies that required thinking beyond standard procedures. Through these forums, Brenda connected with experienced pilots from around the world who shared her philosophy that exceptional circumstances required exceptional responses. A former RAF pilot taught her advanced stall recovery techniques that weren't covered in commercial training. An Alaskan bush pilot shared insights about flying in extreme wind conditions. A cargo pilot from the Himalayas explained how to navigate mountain turbulence using visual cues that instruments couldn't detect. The problem with modern aviation is that we've trained pilots to be systems operators instead of aviators. When the systems fail, many of them don't know how to actually fly the airplane. Brenda internalized this philosophy, dedicating hours to hand-flying practice that most commercial pilots avoided. She practiced approaches without autopilot assistance, navigation without GPS guidance, and emergency procedures without computer-assisted decision-making. These skills, considered archaic by modern standards, provided the foundation for adaptive flying that could handle any situation. Her secret preparation extended to physical conditioning. Understanding that extreme flight situations could subject pilots to significant G-forces and physical stress, Brenda maintained an exercise regimen that emphasized core strength, reaction speed, and stress tolerance. She practiced decision-making exercises under physical duress, simulating the mental challenges that pilots faced during real emergencies. Every technical manual that EuroAir published found its way to Brenda's apartment, usually within hours of release. She studied aircraft specifications, maintenance procedures, and system interactions with an encyclopedic thoroughness. While other pilots relied on quick reference cards and simplified procedures, Brenda understood the underlying engineering principles that governed aircraft behavior. This deep technical knowledge allowed her to anticipate system failures before they became critical, recognize performance anomalies that others might miss, and develop creative solutions to problems that standard procedures couldn't address. Most importantly, Brenda studied human factors in aviation, the psychological and physiological challenges that affected pilot performance during crises. She learned stress management techniques, practiced decision-making under pressure, and developed communication strategies for managing panicked passengers and crews. Her preparation was comprehensive, obsessive, and completely invisible to EuroAir management. While they saw her as a demoted logistics worker, she was quietly becoming one of the most thoroughly prepared pilots in European aviation. Every skill she developed, every scenario she studied, every technique she mastered was building toward a moment when preparation would meet opportunity. What she couldn't predict was that the opportunity would come sooner than she expected, in a form more challenging than anything she had simulated, requiring every skill she had secretly developed during her months of exile from the cockpit. The whispers started during the third week of September, growing like storm clouds on a clear horizon. Brenda first noticed them during the morning briefing when Captain Weber assigned route changes with unusual specificity, his eyes avoiding hers while his voice carried undertones of suspicion that hadn't been there before. "Anderson," he announced, after distributing flight assignments to active pilots, "Security wants to discuss some irregularities in your cargo inspection reports. Report to Chief Security Officer Brennan immediately after this briefing." The room fell silent. Security investigations were serious business in aviation, often preceding suspensions, terminations, or worse. Brenda's stomach knotted as she caught sideways glances from colleagues who'd already begun distancing themselves from potential trouble. In an industry where careers could be destroyed by association, being called to security was like contracting a contagious disease. Chief Security Officer Brennan's office felt like an interrogation room, sterile and intimidating, with its metal desk and formal photographs of aircraft disasters that served as sobering reminders of aviation's unforgiving nature. Brennan, a former police investigator with suspicious eyes and a permanent scowl, studied Brenda's personnel file as if it contained evidence of criminal activity. "Ms. Anderson," he began without preamble, "we've received reports about your activities during off-duty hours, specifically your use of flight simulation facilities and your unusual interest in weather patterns and emergency procedures." Brenda kept her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "I maintain my skills through private practice, sir. There's nothing in EuroAir regulations that prohibits simulator training." "Nothing prohibits it," Brennan agreed, his tone suggesting that legality and appropriateness were different matters. "However, your supervisors are concerned about the intensity of your preparation. 4 nights a week at simulation facilities, weather analysis software, technical manuals that go far beyond your current duties. It raises questions about your intentions." "My intentions are to be the best pilot I can be. I believe in staying prepared for any situation that might arise." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Ms. Anderson, you're not currently authorized for flight duties. Why would a cargo inspection specialist need advanced emergency training? Unless," he paused meaningfully, "unless you're planning something that requires those skills." The implication hit like a physical blow. They suspected her of planning unauthorized actions, perhaps even sabotage. Her dedication to excellence was being twisted into evidence of potentially dangerous intentions. Brenda realized that in an industry obsessed with predictability, exceptional preparation looked like suspicious behavior. "Sir, I'm simply maintaining professional competency in case I'm returned to flight status," she explained, though she could see doubt in Brennan's eyes. Many pilots continue training during temporary assignments. Temporary assignments don't usually involve studying aircraft system failures and emergency procedures with such thoroughness, Brennan countered. "Your training facility reported that you've simulated scenarios involving multiple engine failures, extreme weather conditions, and unconventional landing procedures. Why would someone in your position need that knowledge?" The investigation expanded over the following days. Brennan interviewed her colleagues, requesting details about her behavior, conversations, and any statements that might indicate planning unauthorized activities. The questions were subtle but clear. Was Brenda Anderson preparing to take matters into her own hands? Captain Torres, one of the few pilots who'd remained friendly, approached her privately after his security interview. "Brenda, they're asking if you've ever expressed frustration about being grounded, if you've mentioned wanting to prove yourself, if you've seemed obsessed with emergency procedures. They think you might try something reckless." "Try something like what?" Brenda asked, though she feared she knew the answer. "Like taking unauthorized control of an aircraft during an emergency," Torres replied quietly. "They think you might create a situation where you can demonstrate your skills, regardless of protocols or safety." The accusation was absurd, but terrifying in its implications. EuroAir's security apparatus was building a case that portrayed her preparation as evidence of potential misconduct. They'd transformed her from a capable pilot into a security risk through suspicion and institutional paranoia. Her access to technical facilities was quietly restricted. The Flight Simulation Center received instructions to monitor her sessions more closely. Her personnel file was flagged with security concerns that would follow her to any other airline. Most devastatingly, her clearance for cargo inspection duties was reviewed, threatening even her limited role within EuroAir. "Ms. Anderson," Weber informed her during a private meeting, "until security concerns are resolved, you'll be assigned to administrative duties only. No access to aircraft, cargo areas, or operational facilities." Administrative duties meant a desk in the back office, filing reports and updating databases that had nothing to do with aviation. She found herself completely severed from the industry she'd devoted her life to serving, treated like a potential threat rather than a valuable asset. The psychological pressure was intense. Colleagues avoided her in hallways, conversations stopped when she entered rooms, and her reputation preceded her wherever she went. The pilot who'd been demoted for reckless flying had now become the pilot suspected of planning reckless actions. During sleepless nights, Brenda questioned whether her preparation had been excessive, whether her determination to stay ready had crossed lines she hadn't recognized. But she also knew that her skills and knowledge might someday save lives, that being prepared wasn't the same as being dangerous. The breaking point came when she overheard a conversation between Weber and Brennan outside the administration office. "We can't prove she's planning anything specific, but her behavior pattern suggests someone who might take unauthorized action during an emergency. The liability exposure is too high," Brennan was saying. "Terminate her employment?" Weber asked. "I'm recommending suspension pending full investigation. If she's as dangerous as we suspect, we need her completely removed from operations." Brenda realized that her expertise had become her enemy, that her preparation was being used as evidence against her. EuroAir was determined to eliminate what they perceived as a threat, regardless of her actual intentions or potential value. They'd transformed her from a capable pilot into a security risk through suspicion and institutional paranoia. What they couldn't know was that their investigation was about to become irrelevant, that tomorrow would bring a crisis requiring exactly the kind of preparation they found so threatening, and that their suspected saboteur would become their only hope for preventing a catastrophe that standard procedures couldn't handle.
The suspension notice arrived on a Tuesday morning that had started like any other, delivered with the clinical efficiency that characterized all of EuroAir's bureaucratic communications. Brenda stared at the official letterhead, reading words that effectively ended her aviation career. Effective immediately, pending completion of security investigation, your employment status is suspended without pay. Weber's office felt smaller than usual as she sat across from him, the suspension papers spread between them like evidence in a trial. Beside Weber sat Chief Security Officer Brennan, his expression conveying satisfaction at having neutralized what he perceived as a threat to airline operations. "Miss Anderson," Weber began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "This action is necessary for the safety and security of EuroAir operations. Your pattern of behavior has raised concerns that cannot be ignored." "What pattern?" Brenda asked, though she knew the answer. "Staying current with training, maintaining my skills, preparing to serve this airline effectively?" Brennan leaned forward, consulting a file thick with reports and interviews. "Your pattern includes obsessive preparation for scenarios beyond your current duties, unauthorized access to advanced training materials, and behavior consistent with someone planning unauthorized actions." "Unauthorized actions?" Brenda repeated, the absurdity of the accusation hitting her with fresh force. "You're suspending me for being too prepared to do my job?" "We're suspending you for behavior that suggests you might take matters into your own hands during an emergency. Commercial aviation requires pilots who follow protocols, not individuals who believe they know better than established procedures." The conversation felt like a recurring nightmare from 6 months earlier when they demoted her for saving lives unconventionally. Now they were removing her entirely for preparing to save lives effectively. EuroAir's message was crystal clear. Excellence beyond approved parameters was not just unwanted, it was dangerous. "Sir," Brenda said, her voice steadied despite the fury building inside her. "In 8 years of flying, I've never violated a safety regulation, never endangered passengers, never acted without authorization. My record speaks for itself." "Your record includes a demotion for reckless flying," Brennan countered, "and subsequent behavior that suggests an unwillingness to accept appropriate limitations. That combination makes you a liability we cannot afford." Weber slid a document across the desk. "This is a comprehensive behavioral agreement. If you sign it, agreeing to cease all aviation-related activities and submit to monthly psychological evaluations, we might consider reinstatement after a full year." Brenda read the agreement with growing disbelief. It prohibited her from accessing flight simulators, studying aviation materials, or maintaining pilot certifications. Essentially, it demanded that she abandon her profession entirely in exchange for the possibility of future employment. They wanted her to choose between her passion and her paycheck. "You're asking me to stop being a pilot," she said quietly. "We're asking you to accept your current role and stop preparing for roles we haven't authorized. Your expertise is noted, Miss Anderson, but your judgment regarding appropriate behavior is questionable." The meeting ended with Brenda refusing to sign the behavioral agreement, a decision that Weber noted would be considered evidence of continued uncooperative behavior. She walked out of the office knowing that her career with EuroAir was effectively over, that the airline industry's gossip network would ensure no other carrier would hire someone flagged as a security risk. In the parking lot, she sat in her car and stared at the suspension notice, feeling the weight of institutional rejection that went beyond mere employment termination. They hadn't just fired her, they'd declared her expertise dangerous, her preparation suspicious, and her dedication threatening. Everything that made her an exceptional pilot had been redefined as evidence of instability. Her phone rang with a call from her father. "Brenda, I heard about the suspension. Perhaps it's time to consider that position with the flight training school in Austria. Teaching isn't flying, but it's still aviation." Teaching inexperienced pilots to follow the same procedures that had destroyed her career felt like surrender. But as she drove home through Munich traffic, Brenda wondered if surrender might be her only option. EuroAir had succeeded in painting her as someone whose skills were more dangerous than valuable, whose preparation was more threatening than beneficial. That evening, she began packing her aviation materials into storage boxes, each manual and chart representing knowledge that no airline apparently wanted her to possess. As she folded her pilot uniforms, Brenda reflected on the cruel irony that the industry she had devoted her life to serving had determined that serving it too well made her unfit for service. Her apartment felt hollow without the constant hum of weather analysis software and flight planning applications. The simulator manuals that had been her evening companions were sealed in boxes destined for storage. The aviation charts that had covered her walls were rolled up and packed away like classified documents too dangerous for civilian possession. As she prepared for bed, her radio scanner, a habit from her flying days, crackled with routine air traffic control communications. Munich Tower was handling normal evening operations, vectoring aircraft for approach, coordinating departures, managing the complex ballet of commercial aviation that she was no longer permitted to join. She was about to turn off the scanner when an emergency transmission cut through the routine chatter. "Munich Tower, EuroWings 847, declaring emergency. We have dual engine failure, 89 souls on board, requesting immediate assistance." Her heart stopped. Flight 847 was the morning Munich to Barcelona route, an Airbus I-340 that she knew intimately. Dual engine failure on that aircraft was catastrophic. Without both engines, the plane would become a 200-ton glider with limited options for emergency landing. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate communications as air traffic control scrambled to coordinate an emergency response. But Brenda knew something that the controllers and responding aircraft didn't. The terrain between Flight 847's current position and the nearest suitable airport contained mountain ranges that would make a standard emergency approach impossible. As she listened to the unfolding crisis, Brenda realized that everything she'd been suspended for, her unconventional preparation, her obsessive study of emergency procedures, her detailed knowledge of European terrain and weather patterns, was exactly what Flight 847 needed to survive. For months, EuroAir had insisted that her expertise was dangerous. In a few hours, they would discover that the real danger lay in not having access to it.
EuroWings Flight 847 had departed Munich International at 8:47 a.m. on what Captain Henrik Larsson anticipated would be a routine 3-hour flight to Barcelona. The Airbus A340, registration D-Euro, carried 89 souls, 81 passengers ranging from business travelers to families beginning Mediterranean vacations, plus 8 crew members who'd performed this route hundreds of times without incident. Captain Larsson, a 20-year veteran with an impeccable safety record, had reviewed weather reports showing clear skies across the flight path. First Officer Maria Santos, recently promoted and eager to prove herself competent, handled pre-flight checks with methodical precision. Neither pilot anticipated that their routine Tuesday morning would become one of aviation's most challenging emergencies. The crisis began at 9:23 a.m., just 36 minutes after takeoff, as Flight 847 cruised at 37,000 feet over the Swiss Alps. Passengers were settling into their routines, some working on laptops, others reading novels, children watching entertainment systems, when a massive bird strike occurred that defied every probability calculation in aviation safety manuals. Munich Control, EuroWings 847, Larson's voice crackled over the radio, professional calm masking growing alarm. We've experienced bird strikes to both engines, engine parameters showing severe damage, requesting vectors to nearest suitable airport. The bird strike had been catastrophically perfect. A flock of migrating geese, flying higher than normal due to unusual atmospheric conditions, had impacted both engines simultaneously. The probability was astronomical, the kind of coincidence that safety analysts dismissed as statistically impossible. But statistics offered no comfort to 89 people suddenly aboard a powerless aircraft. Air traffic controller Stefan Mueller, working Munich Control's morning shift, felt his stomach drop as he processed the transmission. Dual engine failure was every controller's nightmare, a scenario that transformed routine traffic management into life-or-death crisis coordination. EuroWings 847 Munich Control confirmed dual engine failure. What is your current position and altitude? Confirmed dual engine failure, Larson replied, his voice tight with concentration. Currently over the Bernese Oberland region, maintaining 37,000 feet. Both engines show no thrust response. We're beginning emergency descent. Mueller's mind raced through available options, while his fingers flew across radar displays, calculating distances to airports that could handle an A340 emergency landing. The mathematics were daunting. Flight 847's position over mountainous terrain limited their choices to airports that were either too small for a large aircraft or too distant for a powerless glide. EuroWings 847, nearest suitable airport is Zurich, bearing 095 degrees, distance 127 nautical miles. Descend and maintain flight level 300. Emergency services are being notified. In the cockpit, Santos pulled out emergency checklists while Larson struggled to maintain aircraft control. The A340, now essentially a 200-ton glider, was descending at rates that made reaching any airport questionable. Worse, the terrain between their position and Zurich included mountain peaks that would require precise navigation to avoid. Munich 847, Larson's transmitted, strain evident in his voice. Our glide ratio indicates we may not reach Zurich, requesting vectors to any closer airfield capable of emergency landing. Mueller consulted his charts desperately. The closest airports were regional facilities with runways too short for a heavy aircraft. Mountain airstrips designed for small planes couldn't accommodate an A340's landing requirements. Every option seemed to lead toward catastrophe. 847, this is Emergency Coordinator Weber. Chief Pilot Weber had rushed to Munich Control upon hearing about the emergency, bringing operational expertise to supplement air traffic control capabilities. Weber, this is Mueller. 847 is approximately 85 miles from Zurich, descending through flight level 280. Current glide performance suggests they won't reach any suitable airport with standard approach procedures. Weber felt ice in his stomach as he studied radar displays showing Flight 847's position relative to the alpine terrain. He knew that particular region intimately. Mountainous country with limited landing options, valleys that could trap aircraft in dangerous wind patterns, and terrain that would challenge even powered aircraft during emergency approaches. 847, this is Chief Pilot Weber at Munich Operations. Can you provide current fuel status and estimated glide endurance? Weber, 847, fuel remaining approximately 8,000 kilograms, but without engine power, fuel quantity is less relevant than glide performance. We estimate 23 minutes of controlled flight time before reaching minimum safe altitude. 23 minutes to find a solution that standard emergency procedures couldn't provide. Weber realized that Flight 847 needed more than air traffic control guidance and emergency checklists. They needed someone who understood alpine terrain, unconventional approach procedures, and creative solutions to impossible situations. They needed exactly the kind of pilot that EuroAir had just suspended for being too prepared.
Brenda Anderson stood in her apartment kitchen,
listening to the emergency communications crackling through her scanner while coffee grew cold in her forgotten mug. Every instinct screamed at her to help, but her suspension meant she had no official authority, no access to EuroAir facilities, and no legal standing to involve herself in the crisis. She was now officially a security risk, someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted. Yet she knew Flight 847's situation better than anyone currently managing the emergency. During her months of secret preparation, she'd studied that exact region obsessively, memorizing every valley, every airstrip, every possible landing site within a 100-mile radius. Her weather analysis software showed atmospheric conditions that would affect glide performance in ways that standard emergency procedures didn't account for. Munich Control 847. Captain Larson's voice carried increasing tension. We're descending through 25,000 feet. Current position shows terrain ahead that may require deviation from direct course to Zurich, requesting guidance on optimal routing. Air traffic controller Muller's response revealed the limitation of ground-based emergency management. 847, maintain heading 095 degrees. Terrain information shows your current course should clear all obstacles. Brenda knew better. Her detailed terrain analysis revealed that heading 095 would take Flight 847 directly through a valley system where downdrafts could accelerate their descent beyond recoverable rates. The standard navigation charts that Muller was using didn't show the micro-scale wind patterns that she'd studied extensively. Her phone rang, interrupting her internal debate about whether to act. The caller ID showed Torres, one of the few pilots who had remained supportive during her suspension. "Brenda, are you monitoring the emergency frequency?" Torres asked, without preamble. "I'm listening," she replied carefully, aware that admitting active monitoring of aviation communications might violate her suspension terms. Flight 847 is in serious trouble. They're gliding toward terrain that's going to kill them all. The route they're flying, the approach they're planning, none of it will work with current atmospheric conditions. Brenda closed her eyes, seeing the scenario clearly in her mind. The valley system between their position and Zurich creates a wind tunnel effect. Standard glide calculations don't account for the downdrafts they'll encounter. "Exactly," Torres said. "You know that region better than anyone. There has to be something." "There is," Brenda replied quietly. "There's an old military airstrip in the Engadin Valley, about 40 miles from their current position. It's not on commercial charts, but it's long enough for an A340 if approached from the northwest to take advantage of valley winds. Can you contact Munich Control? Tell them about the airstrip?" Brenda felt the weight of her impossible choice. Contacting air traffic control would mean violating her suspension terms, potentially facing criminal charges for unauthorized involvement in aviation operations. But staying silent would mean watching 89 people die when she possessed knowledge that could save them. Through her scanner, Brenda heard Flight 847's altitude call. "Munich, 847, descending through 22,000 feet. We're encountering some turbulence. Request vectors around weather if possible." The turbulence they were experiencing was the leading edge of the downdraft system that would ultimately doom their approach to Zurich. Time was running out, and the emergency coordinators were following procedures that would lead inexorably to disaster. "Munich Control, this is Emergency Coordinator Weber. We're exploring alternative landing sites. Are there any military or private airstrips in the region that might accommodate emergency landing?" Brenda's heart raced. Weber was asking exactly the right question, but Muller wouldn't know about the Engadin Valley facility. It wasn't on civilian navigation databases, wasn't marked on standard charts, and wasn't included in emergency airport listings. Only someone who'd studied military aviation history and regional geography would know it existed. She grabbed her phone and dialed Munich Control's emergency number. When the operator answered, Brenda identified herself carefully. "This is Brenda Anderson, former EuroAir captain, current pilot's license holder. I have critical information about emergency landing sites for Flight 847. Ma'am, emergency operations are restricted to authorized personnel only. I'll need to transfer you to..." "There's an airstrip in the Engadin Valley that's not on your charts. Demoted Air Base, runway 14/32, 5,905 feet long. If Flight 847 approaches from the northwest, valley winds will improve their glide performance by approximately 12%. The line went silent for long seconds. Then, "Please hold while I connect you to Emergency Coordinator Weber."
Weber's voice came through with barely controlled tension. "This is Weber. Who am I speaking with?" "Chief Pilot Weber, this is Brenda Anderson. I know I'm suspended, but I have information that could save Flight 847. The silence stretched so long that Brenda wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Weber responded, "Anderson, you're not authorized to participate in emergency operations. This communication is being recorded and will be part of your disciplinary file. Sir, there's a military airstrip in the Engadin Valley that's not on your civilian charts. Samadin Air Base, runway 14/32, 5,905 feet long. If Flight 847 approaches from the northwest, valley winds will improve their glide performance by approximately 12%. Another silence. Then Weber's voice, tight with conflict. "Anderson, if you're wrong about this information..." "I'm not wrong, sir. I've studied that region extensively. The airstrip is their best option given current atmospheric conditions and their glide limitations." Weber faced his own impossible choice: trust the expertise of a pilot EuroAir had suspended for unreliability, or continue following procedures that seemed increasingly inadequate for Flight 847's desperate situation. Through the radio, Captain Larson's voice carried new urgency. "Munich, 847, descending through 19,000 feet. We're not going to make Zurich. Request immediate alternatives." Time had run out for debates about authority and regulations. People were going to live or die based on decisions made in the next few minutes. Weber took a deep breath and made his choice. "Muller, contact Flight 847. Give them vectors to coordinates 46.534 north, 9.884 east. Tell them they're looking for Samadin Air Base." Brenda closed her eyes in relief and terror. She'd committed herself to a course of action that would either save 89 lives or end her aviation career permanently. Either way, there was no turning back now.
The moment Weber relayed the Samadon coordinates to Flight 847, Brenda realized that providing information wasn't enough. Her knowledge of the Engadin Valley's unique atmospheric conditions and the approach procedures for Samadon Air Base was too complex to communicate through air traffic control intermediaries. Captain Larson would need real-time guidance from someone who understood the terrain intimately. "Munich Control, 847, came Larson's strained voice. "We're receiving vectors to Samadon Air Base, but this facility isn't in our navigation database. Can you provide approach information?" Air Traffic Controller Mueller's response revealed the limitation. 847, "We're coordinating with Swiss authorities for approach plate information. Stand by." Brenda knew that standard approach plates wouldn't help. Samadon's military procedures were classified, and the civilian approach charts didn't account for the wind patterns that would be crucial for a successful dead-stick landing. Captain Larson needed guidance that only she could provide. She grabbed her car keys and headed for the door, knowing exactly what she had to do and exactly how much trouble it would cause. Her suspension explicitly prohibited access to EuroAir facilities, but Munich Control was located in a separate building at the airport, technically outside airline property. It was a technicality that might not save her from criminal charges, but it was the only path to reaching Flight 847. The drive to Munich International took 18 minutes that felt like hours. Through her car radio, she monitored Flight 847's increasingly desperate situation. They were descending through 16,000 feet, encountering the wind shear conditions she'd predicted, struggling to maintain control as atmospheric turbulence buffeted the powerless aircraft. "Munich, 847, we're experiencing severe downdrafts. Our descent rate is increasing beyond safe parameters. We need approach guidance immediately." At Munich Control, Emergency Coordinator Weber faced a crisis that standard procedures couldn't resolve. Swiss authorities had confirmed Samadon Air Base's existence, but couldn't provide detailed approach information on short notice. Weather reports showed wind conditions that would challenge even powered aircraft, making a dead-stick approach extremely hazardous. "Sir," Air Traffic Controller Mueller said quietly, "Flight 847 is descending too rapidly to reach Samadon. Their current glide path shows terrain impact before reaching the runway." Weber felt the weight of 89 lives pressing down on him as he studied radar displays that painted an increasingly hopeless picture.
They needed guidance from someone who understood both the aircraft's limitations and the terrain's challenges. They needed expertise that none of the authorized personnel possessed. When Brenda arrived at Munich Control, the security guard initially refused her entry. "Ma'am, you're listed as suspended personnel. I can't allow access to restricted areas. There are 89 people about to die. I have information that can save them, but I need direct radio contact with Captain Larson." The security guard hesitated, torn between regulations and the emergency unfolding in the control room. Through the glass windows, they could see the tense activity as controllers coordinated what appeared to be an impossible rescue attempt. "Please," Brenda pressed, "call Emergency Coordinator Weber. Tell him Brenda Anderson is here with detailed approach information for Samadon Air Base." Minutes later, Weber appeared in the lobby, his face showing the strain of managing an emergency that exceeded all standard procedures. He looked at Brenda with a mixture of desperation and resignation. "Anderson, if you're here to help, I need to know, can you talk that aircraft down safely?" "Yes, sir, but I need direct radio contact with Captain Larson. The approach requires real-time guidance that can't be relayed through intermediaries." Weber's jaw tightened as he considered the implications. Allowing a suspended pilot unauthorized access to emergency communications would violate numerous regulations and potentially subject him to criminal charges. But the alternative was watching Flight 847 crash into the Alps with no viable options remaining. "Give me your assessment. No guarantees about radio access, but tell me what they're facing." Brenda pulled out her phone, displaying weather analysis data that she'd been monitoring throughout the emergency. Current winds in the Engadin Valley are creating a Venturi effect that's increasing their descent rate. But if they approach from bearing 320 degrees instead of the direct route, they can use updrafts along the northern ridge to extend their glide. "How do you know this?" Weber asked. "I've studied this region for months. I know every wind pattern, every terrain feature, every atmospheric condition that affects aircraft performance. Captain Larson needs to execute a spiraling descent through the valley system using energy management techniques that aren't in any commercial manual." Weber stared at her for a long moment, weighing regulations against lives. Through the control room windows, they could see Mueller coordinating with Swiss authorities while Flight 847's altitude continued to drop toward terrain. "Munich, 847, we're descending through 14,000 feet. Terrain proximity warnings are activating. We need approach guidance now or we're going to impact mountainous terrain." Weber made his decision. "Anderson, you have radio contact. But understand that this communication is being recorded and you'll face full accountability for any guidance you provide." Brenda nodded and followed Weber into the control room. As she approached the radio console, every controller turned to look at the suspended pilot who was about to attempt something that had never been tried before, talking a powerless airliner through a mountain approach that only existed in her detailed studies and secret preparation. She keyed the microphone, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was attempting. "EuroWings 847. This is Brenda Anderson, former Euro Air captain. I have detailed knowledge of the Samadon approach. Are you ready to copy specialized guidance?" "Anderson?" Captain Larson's voice carried surprise and hope. "Copy, we're ready for any guidance you can provide." Brenda looked at the radar display showing Flight 847's position relative to the mountainous terrain ahead. Everything she'd studied, everything she'd prepared for, everything that had gotten her suspended for being too thorough was about to be tested in the most demanding scenario possible. "Captain Larson, you're going to execute an approach that's not in any manual. Trust me and follow my guidance exactly. We're going to bring you home." EuroWings 847, turn left heading 320 degrees and begin a controlled spiral descent, Brenda instructed, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had visualized this exact scenario dozens of times. "You're going to use the valley's topography to extend your glide range." Captain Larson's response came immediately. "Turning left to 320, beginning spiral descent. Anderson, our altitude is 13,200 feet and decreasing rapidly. How much deviation can this approach handle?" Brenda consulted her mental map of the Engadin Valley, built through months of obsessive study. You have a 5-mile corridor between ridgelines. The spiral descent will reduce your ground speed while maintaining optimal glide angle. When you reach 11,000 feet, level off and prepare for valley wind transition. In the Munich control room, Weber and the other controllers watched radar displays that showed Flight 847 deviating dramatically from any standard approach procedure. The aircraft was essentially flying a controlled corkscrew pattern through mountainous terrain, guided by someone whose knowledge came from unauthorized preparation rather than official training. "Anderson," Weber whispered, "are you certain about these wind patterns?" "Absolutely," Brenda replied without taking her eyes off the radar. "The valley creates a natural funnel that generates updrafts along the northern ridge. 847 will encounter a 12-knot boost to their effective airspeed when they hit the convergence zone." 847, descending through 11,500 feet, Larson reported. "We're feeling some turbulence, but the aircraft is responding well to control inputs." "That's the transition zone," Brenda explained over the radio. "In 30 seconds, you'll feel the aircraft's descent rate decrease as you enter the valley's updraft region. When that happens, adjust your attitude to optimize for maximum glide distance." Air traffic controller Mueller, monitoring Swiss airspace, provided updates on Samedan Air Base preparation. 847, emergency services are positioning at Samedan. Runway 14 is cleared. Wind currently 290 degrees at 15 knots, gusting to 22. Brenda processed the wind information instantly. "EuroWings 847, the crosswind component will require a significant crab angle during final approach. The valley wind will shift as you descend below 8,000 feet, requiring continuous adjustment." "Understood, Anderson. What's our target altitude for final approach?" "You'll intercept the final approach course at 7,800 feet, approximately 4 miles from the runway threshold. The approach angle will be steeper than standard, approximately 4.5 degrees, but the valley wind will help maintain airspeed." Swiss air traffic control joined the frequency. "EuroWings 847, this is Zurich Control coordinating with Samedan Tower. We show you on an unconventional approach pattern. Confirm you're able to maintain terrain clearance." "Zurich Control 847, we're maintaining terrain clearance and experiencing the updraft conditions as briefed. Descent rate has decreased from 1,200 feet per minute to 800 feet. Brenda smiled grimly. Her months of weather analysis and terrain study were paying off exactly as she'd calculated. "EuroWings 847, you're doing perfectly. Begin your turn to final approach heading when you reach 8,200 feet. Target heading 140. "Beginning turn to final heading 140. Anderson, we can see the runway ahead. It looks short for our aircraft type. "The runway is adequate if you touch down in the first 1,000 feet. You'll have maximum braking effectiveness on the concrete surface, and the upslope of the runway will help decelerate the aircraft." In the passenger cabin, Flight Attendant Chief Rodriguez prepared the cabin for emergency landing. Passengers had remained remarkably calm throughout the crisis, trusting in professional crew competence and unaware of how unprecedented their situation really was. Few commercial pilots had ever attempted a dead-stick landing in mountainous terrain, and none had done so with the kind of real-time guidance Brenda was providing. 847, descending through 8,000 feet, turning final approach, Larson reported. "We have the runway in sight. Approach looks stable. Maintain your current descent rate. At 1,000 feet above ground level, you'll encounter valley turbulence. Don't let it distract you. The aircraft will settle as you get closer to the runway." Weber stood behind Brenda, watching the radar display that showed Flight 847 aligned with Samedan's runway on an approach that defied every standard procedure he'd ever learned. The suspended pilot was guiding 89 people through a landing that required expertise no authorized person possessed. 500 feet above ground level, Larson called. "Approach is stable, airspeed holding steady." "Perfect, Captain. Maintain current configuration. Touchdown will be firm but controlled. Full braking immediately on ground contact. 100 feet, 50 feet. Touchdown." The radio crackled with the sound of reverse thrust that didn't exist, followed by the screech of brakes working at maximum effectiveness. Then after a few tense seconds, Captain Larson's voice returned with barely controlled emotion. Munich Control, EuroWings 847 is safely on the ground at Samadan Air Base. All souls aboard are safe. The Munich control room erupted in cheers and applause, but Brenda simply set down the microphone and closed her eyes. She'd done something that violated her suspension, exceeded her authority, and ignored every regulation that governed commercial aviation. She'd also saved 89 lives using knowledge that EuroAir had deemed too dangerous to trust. Weber approached her with an expression that mixed admiration with professional concern. "Anderson, what you just accomplished was remarkable. It was also completely unauthorized and will require a full investigation." Brenda nodded, understanding that her actions would have consequences regardless of their success. "Sir, I understand, but 89 people are alive who wouldn't have been if I'd followed my suspension terms." Flight 847, this is Munich Control. Congratulations on a successful emergency landing. Emergency services are responding to your location. As reports came in that all passengers and crew were evacuating safely with only minor injuries, Brenda realized that she'd achieved something unprecedented. She'd proven that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do was follow the rules when breaking them could save lives. The investigation that would follow would determine whether EuroAir considered her a hero or a criminal. But for now, 89 people were breathing because someone had been too prepared, too knowledgeable, and too willing to risk everything for others' safety.
The investigation committee convened 3 days after the Samadan rescue in EuroAir's main conference room, a sterile space where corporate decisions typically involved profit margins rather than life-and-death situations. Brenda sat across from a panel that included Chief Pilot Weber, Chief Security Officer Brennan, 2 executives from EuroAir's legal department, and a representative from the European Aviation Safety Agency. The morning newspapers had already declared her a hero. "Suspended pilot saves 89 lives" dominated headlines across Europe, with detailed accounts of how her unauthorized intervention had prevented what analysts called certain catastrophe. Television news programs featured aviation experts explaining why the Samadan approach would have been impossible without intimate knowledge of alpine weather patterns and unconventional landing procedures. But corporate boardrooms operated by different rules than public opinion. Ms. Anderson, began Legal Director Klaus Hoffmann, consulting a thick file that documented every regulation she'd violated. While the outcome of Flight 847 was fortunate, your actions during the emergency created significant legal and operational concerns for this airline. Brenda had spent 3 sleepless nights preparing for this moment, knowing that success could be just as damaging to her career as failure. "Sir, I understand the regulatory implications of my actions, but I also understand that 89 people are alive because I chose to act rather than follow my suspension terms." That choice, Security Chief Brennan interjected, demonstrates exactly the kind of decision-making that led to your suspension in the first place. You consistently believe that your judgment supersedes established authority and procedures. The accusation stung because it contained elements of truth. Brenda had indeed placed her assessment of the situation above official protocols. She'd violated her suspension, accessed restricted communications, and provided unauthorized guidance to an aircraft in distress. By every regulatory standard, her actions warranted severe disciplinary measures. "Mr. Brennan, my judgment was based on specific knowledge that no authorized person possessed. Captain Larson and his crew were facing certain death following standard procedures. Someone had to provide the information they needed to survive." Weber leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Anderson, explain to this committee why you believed your unauthorized intervention was more valuable than coordinated emergency response from qualified air traffic controllers and airline operations personnel." The question cut to the heart of everything that had gone wrong with her career at EuroAir. "Sir, the qualified personnel were following procedures designed for standard emergencies. Flight 84-7's situation required knowledge that exists outside normal training programs. I'd studied that specific region and those atmospheric conditions extensively because I believed that someday someone might need that information. And that's precisely the problem, Hoffman stated. You conducted unauthorized preparation for scenarios beyond your assigned duties, then used that preparation to justify violating your suspension. This pattern suggests someone who creates justifications for ignoring authority. EASA Representative Maria Santos spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the weight of regulatory authority. Ms. Santos, from a safety perspective, your guidance prevented a catastrophic accident. However, from a systemic perspective, your actions represent a breakdown in aviation's command structure. If every pilot decided independently when to violate protocols, the entire industry would become unpredictable. Brenda felt the familiar frustration that had characterized her entire relationship with EuroAir's management. Ms. Santos, I didn't decide independently. I was faced with a situation where following protocols meant watching people die when I possessed knowledge that could save them. That's not a breakdown in command structure. That's the difference between serving regulations and serving human life. Your suspension, Brennan continued, was specifically designed to prevent exactly this type of unauthorized action. You were deemed a risk because you consistently prioritized your personal judgment over institutional authority. The Samadan incident proves that our concerns were justified. The twisted logic was breathtaking. They were arguing that her success proved their need to prevent her from succeeding. Brenda realized that EuroAir's institutional framework couldn't accommodate the possibility that unofficial knowledge might be more valuable than official procedures. Legal Director Hoffman presented the committee's preliminary findings. Ms. Anderson, your violation of suspension terms, unauthorized access to emergency communications, and provision of unvalidated guidance to aircraft in distress constitute serious breaches of aviation regulations. The positive outcome doesn't eliminate the procedural violations. However, Weber added, his tone suggesting internal conflict, the technical accuracy of your guidance and the successful outcome create complications in determining appropriate disciplinary action. The committee faced their own impossible choice. Punishing someone who'd saved 89 lives would create public relations disasters and raise questions about institutional priorities. But failing to punish clear regulatory violations would undermine the authority structure that governed commercial aviation. Ms. Santos, ASA representative, concluded, your case will require extensive review at multiple regulatory levels. The technical success of your intervention must be balanced against the systemic implications of unauthorized actions. Until that review is complete, your aviation credentials remain suspended. Brenda nodded, understanding that bureaucratic machinery moved slowly, especially when confronted with situations that didn't fit standard categories. She'd proven that her expertise could save lives, but she'd also proven that her judgment operated outside accepted boundaries. As the committee adjourned, Weber approached her privately. Anderson, what you accomplished was remarkable, but you have to understand that we can't operate an airline where pilots decide independently when rules apply. Sir, I understand your position, but I hope you understand mine. Sometimes saving lives requires breaking rules, and I'll always choose lives over regulations. Weber's expression suggested he understood more than he could officially acknowledge. The investigation would continue, but the fundamental conflict remained unchanged. EuroAir wanted predictable pilots, while aviation emergencies sometimes required exceptional ones.
6 weeks after the Samadan rescue, Brenda received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The caller identified himself as Captain Thomas Richter, chief pilot for Swiss Air Rescue.
the elite Alpine rescue service that operated in some of the world's most challenging terrain. "Miss Anderson?" Richter's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to life-and-death decisions. "I've been following your case with great interest. I believe Swiss Air Rescue could benefit from your unique expertise." Brenda almost dropped the phone. Swiss Air Rescue was legendary in aviation circles. The organization that responded to mountain emergencies, conducted medical evacuations in impossible conditions, and flew missions that commercial airlines wouldn't attempt. They were the pilots that other pilots respected without reservation. "Captain Richter, I'm currently under investigation by multiple regulatory bodies. My aviation credentials remain suspended pending review." "I'm aware of your situation. I'm also aware that you saved 89 lives using knowledge and skills that took months of unauthorized preparation to develop. That's exactly the kind of preparation we require for Alpine rescue operations." The conversation marked the beginning of a transformation that neither EuroAir nor the regulatory investigators had anticipated. While bureaucrats debated whether Brenda's actions represented dangerous insubordination, the aviation community's most respected professionals recognized her expertise as invaluable. Captain Eric Johansson from SAS Airlines contacted her next, followed by Chief Pilot Maria Gonzalez from Iberia. Word had spread through unofficial channels about the suspended pilot who'd accomplished something unprecedented, and airlines that specialized in challenging operations wanted access to her knowledge. "Anderson," Johansson explained during their conversation, "what you did at Samadan couldn't be taught in any training program. It required understanding terrain, weather, and aircraft performance in ways that go far beyond standard procedures. We need pilots who can think beyond the manual." The most significant recognition came from an unexpected source: Captain Henrik Larsson, the pilot she'd guided through the emergency landing. His testimony to investigators provided crucial context that regulatory officials couldn't ignore. "Without Anderson's guidance," Larsson stated during his formal deposition, "Flight 847 would have crashed into the Alps with total loss of life. Her knowledge of terrain and atmospheric conditions was the difference between survival and catastrophe. She didn't violate procedures recklessly. She saved lives precisely." Larsson's crew backed his assessment unanimously. First Officer Santos testified that Brenda's real-time guidance had been technically perfect and delivered with calm professionalism under extreme pressure. Flight Attendant Chief Rodriguez described how passenger confidence remained high throughout the emergency because the pilot providing guidance clearly understood exactly what we were facing. Even more powerful was passenger testimony. Maria Weber, a mother traveling with 2 young children, spoke directly to media outlets. "That woman saved my baby's lives. I don't care what regulations she violated. She brought us home safely when everyone else was following procedures that weren't working." The public pressure became intense. Aviation safety organizations found themselves defending regulations that seemed to punish competence, while European Parliament members questioned why regulatory frameworks discouraged the kind of preparation that had prevented disaster. Dr. Andreas Müller, director of the European Flight Safety Foundation, issued a statement that marked a turning point in professional opinion. "The Samadan incident demonstrates that exceptional circumstances require exceptional expertise. Regulatory frameworks must accommodate the reality that sometimes saving lives requires actions that exceed standard procedures." 3 months after the rescue, Swiss Aviation Authority Director Clara Zimmermann announced the formation of a special review committee to examine Brenda's case. The committee included representatives from multiple European aviation authorities, airline safety organizations, and pilot associations. Ms. Anderson's actions raise fundamental questions about the relationship between regulatory compliance and operational safety. We must determine whether current frameworks adequately accommodate the kind of expertise that prevented the Flight 847 tragedy.
The review committee's findings, released after extensive technical analysis, vindicated every aspect of Brenda's guidance. Independent weather analysis confirmed her predictions about valley wind patterns. Terrain modeling validated her approach route recommendations. Aircraft performance calculations proved that standard emergency procedures would have been inadequate for Flight 847's situation. Miss Anderson's unauthorized intervention demonstrated technical competence that prevented certain loss of life. While her actions violated established procedures, they also revealed gaps in emergency response capabilities that require immediate attention. More importantly, the committee recommended changes to aviation regulations that would create pathways for pilots with specialized knowledge to contribute to emergency responses. They proposed expert pilot databases, expanded training programs, and protocols for accessing non-standard expertise during crisis situations. Captain Richter's job offer became official. Anderson, Swiss Air Rescue formally invites you to join our Alpine Operations Division. Your credentials would be fully restored, and you'd be training pilots in exactly the kind of unconventional techniques that saved Flight 847. For the first time in months, Brenda felt hope replacing despair. The aviation industry was recognizing that her dangerous expertise was actually invaluable, that her excessive preparation was exactly what emergency situations required. EuroAir's response came through Chief Pilot Weber, who contacted her with obvious reluctance. Anderson, management has authorized me to discuss your potential reinstatement. Given recent developments, the airline believes your expertise might be appropriately utilized in our safety and training divisions. The offer represented complete reversal from the airline that had suspended her for being too prepared. But Brenda realized that her future lay with organizations that valued exceptional competence rather than merely tolerating it. Mr. Weber, I appreciate the offer, but I've accepted a position where my preparation and expertise are considered assets rather than liabilities. The aviation industry was learning that sometimes the most dangerous pilots were those who followed procedures without thinking, while the safest were those who thought beyond procedures to save lives.
18 months after the Samadan rescue, Captain Brenda Anderson stood in the cockpit of a Swiss Air Rescue Eurocopter H-145, preparing for a medical evacuation mission that would have been impossible for conventional emergency services. The call had come in at dawn, a climber with severe injuries stranded on the Matterhorn's north face, weather conditions deteriorating rapidly, and a rescue window measured in minutes rather than hours. Captain Anderson, her co-pilot, First Officer Marcus Weber, no relation to her former chief pilot, consulted weather data on their avionics display. The meteorological conditions show wind shear and downdrafts that exceed standard operational limits. Mission parameters suggest we should abort until conditions improve. Brenda smiled at the familiar tension between procedures and possibilities. Marcus, standard operational limits assume standard missions. This isn't standard. The transformation in her life had been remarkable. Swiss Air Rescue had not only restored her credentials, but elevated her to captain status within their elite mountain rescue division. Her controversial expertise in alpine weather patterns and unconventional flying techniques had become her greatest professional assets. More significantly, she'd become an instructor at the newly established European Alpine Aviation Academy, where pilots from across the continent came to learn the advanced techniques that commercial training programs didn't cover. Her courses on emergency operations beyond standard procedures were consistently overbooked, filled with pilots who understood that exceptional situations required exceptional skills. Marcus, we're going to use the same principles that guided Flight 847, Brenda explained as they lifted off from their Zermatt base. The mountain's geometry creates predictable wind patterns if you understand the topography. We'll approach from the eastern ridge, using valley updrafts to maintain altitude while avoiding the downdraft zones. The rescue mission required precisely the kind of flying that had gotten her suspended from EuroAir. Unconventional approach angles, aggressive maneuvering through mountain terrain, and split-second decision-making based on atmospheric conditions that standard instruments couldn't adequately measure. But now, instead of being punished for such techniques, she was celebrated for them. Swiss Air Rescue's mission profile demanded pilots who could operate beyond normal limitations, who could read weather patterns intuitively, and who could improvise solutions when standard procedures were inadequate. "Approaching the target area," Marcus reported, as they navigated through clouds that obscured traditional visual references. "I can see the stranded climber on the north face approximately 200 meters below the summit." Brenda studied the terrain through breaks in the cloud cover, analyzing wind patterns by observing snow movement on ridgelines and calculating approach angles that would position them for a successful rescue. The techniques she'd developed during her months of excessive preparation now guided life-saving missions on a regular basis. "Initiating approach," she announced, beginning a spiraling descent that used the mountain's own wind patterns to maintain controlled flight in conditions that would challenge most helicopter pilots. "Marcus, prepare the rescue hoist. We'll have approximately 3 minutes in the pickup zone before wind conditions force us to retreat." The rescue proceeded flawlessly, with Brenda demonstrating exactly the kind of precise mountain flying that had made her notorious in commercial aviation. The injured climber was lifted to safety using techniques that required understanding atmospheric physics, mountain weather behavior, and aircraft performance characteristics that no training manual covered comprehensively. "Swiss Rescue 7, this is Zermatt Base. Excellent work on the north face extraction. Weather services report that conventional helicopters grounded due to conditions you just flew through successfully." Back at base, Brenda reflected on the journey from suspended pilot to respected rescue captain. The same skills that EuroAir had considered dangerous were now saving lives regularly, and the preparation they deemed excessive was proving essential for alpine operations. Her story had become legend in aviation circles. Flight 847's passengers organized annual reunions where they honored the pilot who'd guided them to safety using knowledge that airlines hadn't wanted her to possess. Captain Larson frequently spoke at aviation conferences about the rescue, emphasizing how unconventional expertise had made conventional disaster impossible. Most satisfying was the institutional change her case had generated. European aviation authorities had established new protocols for accessing specialized expertise during emergencies. The Anderson Protocols created procedures for consulting pilots with unique knowledge during crisis situations, ensuring that future emergencies wouldn't be limited by standard response capabilities. Captain First Officer Weber said as they completed their post-mission debriefing, "How did you know the wind patterns would allow that approach? The meteorological data suggested it was impossible." Brenda handed him a detailed topographical chart of the Matterhorn region, annotated with wind pattern analyses and approach route options. "Marcus, this is what excessive preparation looks like. I spent months studying this mountain's weather behavior because I knew that someday someone would need rescue in conditions that standard procedures couldn't handle." "And EuroAir suspended you for this kind of preparation?" "They suspended me because they couldn't imagine situations where such preparation would be necessary. They valued predictability over capability, compliance over competence." As evening settled over the Swiss Alps, Brenda looked at her flight schedule for the following week. Advanced mountain weather seminars for Lufthansa pilots, emergency procedure consulting for Air France, and a rescue equipment demonstration for Nordic aviation authorities. The pilot they'd once considered too dangerous to fly was now teaching others how to fly safely in the most challenging conditions imaginable. Her radio crackled with another emergency call. "Swiss Rescue, this is Geneva Control. We have a commercial aircraft declaring emergency over the Bernese Overland, requesting immediate consultation with Captain Anderson for alpine weather guidance." Brenda smiled and reached for her microphone. Some things never changed. Aircraft still encountered situations that exceeded standard procedures. Weather still created challenges that required innovative solutions, and lives still depended on pilots who'd prepared for possibilities that others couldn't imagine.
The difference was that now, instead of being punished for such preparation, she was exactly where she belonged, saving lives with skills that the aviation industry had finally learned to value rather than fear. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.